Motion blur can be a very creative tool if it's done properly, but the motion blur that you'd likely want to try and avoid is camera shake, and that's from just taking a photo and not having a fast enough shutter speed. So I want to talk you through my process of how I take photos with the right shutter speed. So first of all, let's talk about handheld photography. When I take a photo and I don't have a tripod like this, I know that I can take a photo at about the same number as the focal length. So if I'm taking a photo at 50mm, I can take a photo at around 1/50th of a second. It's a very easy rule, and I know that if I hold tight and whatever I'm shooting is not moving, there's not going to be much camera blur or motion shake. It's a simple rule. Try it for yourself, usually around 1 or 1.5 of what you're shooting. So maybe if you're shooting at 50mm, you need 1/75th of a second to prevent motion blur. Experiment for yourself. If you're using a crop sensor, it's probably going to be a little bit higher, 1/80th of a second, 100th of a second, so bear that in mind. So when you're taking photos and you want to avoid motion blur, that needs to be your top priority. It's that one thing you can't fix in post. Okay, your photos are underexposed, you can boost that in post-production. Let's say your photos are a bit noisy, you can fix that a little bit in post-production. If your photos have camera shake in them, you can't fix that. So shutter speed is always a high priority when it comes to setting the exposure. Next, let's talk about what you're shooting. So different things that you shoot will require different shutter speeds. If I'm shooting a Formula One racing car driving past at a high speed, maybe I want 1/4000th of a second. If I'm shooting an indoor portrait and there's someone 5 meters away and I'm using a long focal length, perhaps 1/200th of a second. If I'm shooting the Milky Way, I'm doing long exposure night photography. I want 30 seconds. It all depends on what you're shooting. We have the sea behind us and it's crashing against the shore. And I want to take 2 photos, one with some motion blur from the sea, a very creative way of taking photos of the sea, and one that freezes that motion. I'm going to set my shutter speed here to 1/80th of a second, and I'm going to zoom into 70mm. So I know I'm not going to get camera shake from my camera. And if I take a photo of it crashing over here, and I'm going to focus quite close to where I am, I'm going to see what kind of motion blur I capture. Waited for it to crash there. So if I zoom in, I do see a little bit of motion blur, and it's actually quite creative. I like the look of it. I'm going to take that photo again now, but this time I want to avoid any motion blur. So to do that, I'm going to change the exposure to 1/400th of a second. And this time, as I zoom in, I can see that there's basically no motion blur at all, and I've caught that wave just crashing slightly as it came over. So it all depends on what you're shooting. If something's moving really fast and you don't want motion blur, you need a fast shutter speed. But sometimes you do want motion blur. Sometimes if you're shooting at night, for example, you see photos of cars that drive through motorways and you just see the light trails. You don't see the car at all because it's such a long exposure. Very creative use, good way to take a photograph. Let's say I'm going to take a photograph while I'm out at sea. I'm in a boat, it's moving fast, it's in the waves, and I want to take a photo of the land in the distance. Well, I know that I'm going to have a problem because I'm moving around, shaking in this boat. I need to make sure that I have a higher shutter speed because the surface I'm on is no longer steady either. It's all about considering what you're shooting and whether you want motion blur or not. If you do want motion blur, try and use a tripod. That is a huge help when it comes to motion blur with photography, because most people who want motion blur don't want motion blur from their hand shaking. They want it from whatever's in the scene moving instead. So a tripod is your best friend in this case. I have seen some old film photography where there's some motion blur and it looks absolutely beautiful. Motion blur from the camera, but we don't get that same effect with a digital camera, and a lot of the time I just don't think it looks very professional to have motion blur from your camera. Here we're taking another photo with my camera on the tripod, and I want to experiment with a couple of different shutter speeds. I want to capture some motion blur, and I also want to capture no motion. I want to freeze that motion. So let's see how that works. First of all, I'm just going to set the shutter speed to around 1/20th of a second. If I zoom in on this frame, I can see some motion blur. It's kind of this horrible middle ground motion blur. I don't think that looks particularly good. I either want motion blur or I want sharpness. So let's experiment again. This time I'm going to go for a sharp photo. Let's turn the ISO up to say 400, and the shutter speed is going to be 1/400th of a second. It'll be impossible not to get a sharp photo here of the water crashing. And that should freeze all motion, which it does. And let's go the other way this time. Let's capture some motion. And bring the ISO back down to 100. I'm going to bring the exposure compensation meter back into the middle, and I'm going to have a 1 second exposure. And this time we've got a nice soft motion blur. It's up to you to experiment and see the different shutter speeds that you like to play with. Personally, I think that this is a slightly too long shutter speed. I don't want just a little bit of blur. I don't want total sharpness if I'm looking for motion blur, obviously. But what I do want is a little bit of that sharpness with some motion blur, so you can see the shape of it, but also that motion blur runs over the top of it. At the moment, we've lost the shape of these waves. So I'm going to experiment. Let's try half a second now. And I have to say, I think that's better because you get to see some of the crash of the water, the white crashes, and you get the motion blur that runs over the top. So experiment with different shutter speeds and find out what works best for your scene. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about shutter speed, please leave us a question below. Thank you.